Thomas Palmer grabbed his sister's wrist so hard she cried out, dragging her into the middle of Promise Creek's main street like she was a sack of grain he'd grown tired of hauling. $200, he announced to the men loitering outside the saloon, his voice carrying the flat confidence of a man who believed he owned everything within arm's reach. She cooks, she cleans, she doesn't talk back much. He shook her wrist when she tried to pull away. 200, cash, right now. Elizabeth Palmer was 26 years old, and she had just become merchandise. If this story already has your blood up, good. It should. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elizabeth's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning had started the way most mornings started in Promise Creek, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1876, with cold air off the plains that cut right through whatever you were wearing, and the particular silence of a town that hadn't fully decided whether it wanted to be civilized yet. Elizabeth had been awake since before dawn. That was nothing new. She'd been waking before dawn since she was 8 years old when her mother first put a cast-iron skillet in her hands and said, "You'll thank me for this someday, Lizzie." Her mother had been right about that, wrong about a few other things, and then dead of fever by the time Elizabeth was 14, which left her and Thomas and their father, James Palmer, alone on 40 acres of decent grazing land 6 miles east of town. James Palmer had been a hard man but a fair one. He believed in work, believed in keeping your word, believed in the simple arithmetic of a life honestly lived. He had kept the ranch running through drought and bad cattle prices and one exceptionally brutal winter that killed 17 head and nearly killed him alongside them. He had not believed in drinking past one glass, had not believed in gambling, and had spent the last year of his life believing, quietly and without much complaint, that Thomas was going to be a serious problem once he was gone. He'd been right about that too. James died in March. By June, Thomas had lost the cattle to debt. By August, the ranch itself was mortgaged to a man named Cutter, who ran the land office in town, and whose methods of acquiring property were the subject of considerable whispered conversation but very little public accusation. By September, Elizabeth had watched her brother drink away whatever remained of her father's savings and begin the process of deciding that his problems were, in some fundamental way, her fault. She didn't know exactly when Thomas had arrived at the conclusion that she was something he could sell. She suspected it had happened gradually, the way most bad ideas happen, one small rationalization at a time, each one slightly worse than the last, until you were standing in the middle of a public street announcing a price. 200, Thomas said again, louder this time, because the men outside the saloon hadn't moved yet. He still had her wrist, his grip hadn't loosened even a fraction. Thomas. Her voice was quiet. She'd learned that much, that raising her voice only made things worse with him, only gave him something to react against. Thomas, let go of me. Shut up. He said it without even looking at her, which was somehow worse than the grip. He was scanning the faces of the men on the boardwalk with the focused expression of a man conducting legitimate business. I'm trying to handle something here. There were 4 men watching. 2 of them she recognized, Harlan Cross, who ran a small spread north of town, and his cousin Deke, who mostly ran errands for whoever would pay him. The other 2 she didn't know. They were the type that drifted through frontier towns and didn't leave much of an impression except for a vague feeling of unease. It was one of the unknown ones, a heavy-set man with a red beard and the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, who spoke first. What's wrong with her? Thomas blinked. Nothing's wrong with her. Then why are you selling? Because I don't need her anymore. I'm moving on. She needs a situation. You need a cook and a housekeeper. Simple. Redbeard looked Elizabeth over with the detached assessment of someone evaluating a horse. She felt the blood rise in her face, felt the complicated mixture of shame and fury that had been her constant companion for the past 6 months. The shame of being looked at this way, the fury at herself for feeling the shame, the deeper fury at Thomas for creating a situation where shame was even a factor. She looks like she's got some opinions, Redbeard said. She'll get over it. Thomas. Her voice was harder now, the quiet strategy abandoned. I am not doing this. I'm not going to stand here while you... He jerked her wrist, and she stumbled a half step toward him, and that small, ugly movement, a man yanking his sister off balance in front of a crowd of strangers, was the moment that a man named Matthew Morgan, who had ridden into Promise Creek 20 minutes earlier looking for nothing more complicated than a hot meal and a dry place to sleep, decided to stop walking past. He had been on the far side of the street. He'd seen what was happening from 50 yards out, had assessed it in the flat, direct way he assessed most things, and had initially made the calculation that it wasn't his business. He'd made that calculation about a lot of things over the years. It was a practical calculation, the kind that kept a man alive and unentangled in a world that offered endless opportunities to become both dead and entangled. But he'd seen the stumble, the involuntary half-step, the way her free hand came out for balance just for a half-second before she pulled herself upright again. He crossed the street. He wasn't a large man, not in the way that Redbeard was large. He was lean and long in the way of men who covered a lot of ground on horseback and didn't eat more than they needed. He wore a gray canvas coat that had seen considerable use and a hat that had been good quality once, a long time ago. He walked at a pace that wasn't hurried and wasn't slow, and the only thing about him that might have warranted a second look was the fact that he walked like he'd never once in his life been uncertain about where his feet were going. He stopped about 6 feet from Thomas Palmer and put his hands in his coat pockets. "What's the number?" he said. Thomas turned, squinting against the morning light. 200. For what exactly? She cooks, cleans, knows horses. Good worker. Matthew nodded slowly, as if he were genuinely considering this. And she's... He paused. What is she to you? My sister. The word landed in the street between them. Matthew let it sit there for a moment. Your sister, he repeated. That's what I said. Matthew rocked back slightly on his heels. And she agreed to this arrangement? Thomas's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. That's my business. I'm thinking about making it mine. You got $200 or not? I got a question first. Matthew turned and looked at Elizabeth directly for the first time. Ma'am, you want to be sold? She stared at him. She had been stared at all morning by Harlan Cross, who'd had the decency to look uncomfortable, by Deke, who had the decency of a fence post, by Redbeard and his companion, who had no decency at all. She was accustomed, in those 6 months since her father died, to men looking at her and seeing a problem or a commodity or an inconvenience. This man looked at her and waited for her answer. No, she said. I do not. Matthew turned back to Thomas. Then I'd say this transaction's off. Thomas released her wrist. Not because he wanted to, she understood, but because something in Matthew's posture had communicated clearly that having 2 hands free was about to become relevant. He squared himself up, and she could see him doing the arithmetic that drunk and reckless men do when they're deciding whether someone is actually dangerous or just acting it. Who do you think you are? Thomas said. Someone passing through. But a man who tries to sell his own sister becomes everyone's concern. That's my business. She's my blood. That means... It means exactly nothing. The quietness of Matthew's voice was more effective than shouting would have been. You don't own her. You're not her father, and even if you were, this wouldn't be legal or decent in any state of this union, including Wyoming territory. I'm her brother. That gives me... You're her nothing. Matthew took 1 step forward, and Thomas took 1 step back, and that small exchange of ground told Elizabeth everything she needed to know about how this was going to end. You're a man who's drunk before noon and trying to sell a woman in a public street. That's what you are. Redbeard had been watching this with the relaxed attention of a man watching a card game that didn't involve his money. Now he shifted his weight. Hey, we were in the middle of something here. Matthew looked at him, just looked at him for about 3 seconds. You were in the middle of trying to buy a woman against her will, he said. I'd think carefully about whether that's a conversation you want to continue. Redbeard's companion, a narrow man with a mustache and the quick, evaluating eyes of someone who made a habit of calculating odds, put a hand on Redbeard's arm. Something passed between them, some private communication of practical men who understood when a situation had moved outside their preferred risk parameters. Come on, Mustache said quietly. Redbeard didn't look happy, but he allowed himself to be steered. They moved off down the boardwalk with the unhurried pace of men pretending they'd just remembered something more important elsewhere. Thomas, meanwhile, had found a second wind. Maybe it was the departure of the strangers that emboldened him, or maybe it was the gathering audience, because a crowd had materialized, the way frontier town crowds always materialized around conflict, filtering in from storefronts and side streets with the practiced casualness of people who absolutely were not watching. Thomas straightened up, and his hand moved toward the gun at his hip. Matthew's hand moved faster. He didn't draw, not fully. His hand came up, and the barrel of his revolver caught the morning light for just long enough for Thomas to register what it was and where it was pointed, and then Matthew's hand settled and was still, and the gun was there and aimed and very calmly present. Thomas froze. "I don't want to shoot you," Matthew said. "You're her brother, which means she'd have to carry that. But I will put you on the ground if you make me." The crowd watched. Someone coughed. Thomas's hand moved away from his hip. He did it slowly, with the resentful deliberateness of a man who needed everyone present to understand that he was choosing to move his hand, that this was a choice he was making of his own free will and not in any way because he was afraid. "This isn't over," he said. "I expect it's not," Matthew said, "but it's over for right now." Thomas looked at Elizabeth. The look on his face was not grief, not remorse, not even anger at himself. It was the look of a man who has lost a resource he felt entitled to and is already calculating how to recover it. She had grown up with that face. She knew it better than she knew her own reflection. It turned her stomach in a way that was by now almost familiar. "Don't think he's going to save you," Thomas said to her. She didn't answer. She'd learned that too. That answering him only extended things, only gave him more ground to stand on. She held his gaze until he looked away first, which he did, and then he walked off toward the saloon with his spine very straight and his shoulders very tight, the posture of a man holding his dignity together through sheer determination. The crowd began to disperse. Matthew holstered his weapon and turned to look at her. "You all right?" She examined that question for a moment. She was not, in any technical sense, all right. Her wrist hurt, her face was still burning, and the particular humiliation of being stood in a street with a price attached to her was not something she was going to recover from in the next 30 seconds. But she was standing upright, and she was alone, and no one was holding her arm. "I'm alive," she said. "That's what I've got right now." He nodded, accepting this as the honest answer it was. "You have somewhere to go?" "Not particularly." "Family?" "Just him." Something crossed his expression. Not pity, she was relieved to see. Something more like recognition. The look of a person who understood what it was to be completely without a safety net and was not going to make a performance out of the understanding. "My name's Matthew Morgan," he said. "I'm headed to Laramie. I ride for a ranch called the Rocking Jay. Owner's a man named Cole Whitfield. He's been looking for a cook. The pay's fair, the bunkhouse is separate, and Whitfield doesn't tolerate trouble." She looked at him. "You're offering me work. I'm offering you an option. You don't have to take it. You don't know me. I know enough." He said it simply, without elaboration, which she found both strange and, if she was being honest with herself, rather more reassuring than a longer speech would have been. She was quiet for a moment. Down the street, she could see the doors of the saloon swinging closed behind Thomas. She thought about the ranch, the empty house, the mortgaged land, the bedroom where her mother's things still sat in a cedar chest because she hadn't been able to make herself move them. She thought about the locket. "I need to go back to the ranch first," she said, "before I go anywhere." He didn't ask why, which she appreciated. "When?" "Now, before he gets drunk enough to get there first." He considered this for exactly the length of time it deserved, which was not very long. "My horse is at the livery. You got a way out there?" "There's a mare in the livery. Belonged to my father. I've been paying the board out of what I had left." She paused. "What's left won't last another week." "Then let's go before it gets complicated." She almost said something, almost offered some kind of formal acknowledgement of what he'd done, some version of thank you that matched the size of the gesture. But the words felt small against the morning's events, and she got the sense that he wasn't someone who needed that kind of accounting balanced in his presence. She just said, All right. They were halfway to the livery when Sheriff Donovan appeared from the direction of his office, moving with the slightly irritated efficiency of a man who has been informed of a disturbance and is not sure he wanted to be. Donovan was 60, gray-haired, with a face like weathered saddle leather, and eyes that had seen enough of Wyoming to remain unimpressed by most of it. He looked at Matthew first, then at Elizabeth, then back at Matthew. "Heard there was a situation," he said. "There was," Matthew said. "It's handled." Donovan looked at Elizabeth's wrist, which had begun to show the early suggestion of bruising. "Your brother do that?" "Yes." "He's in the saloon right now, most likely." "Most likely." Donovan chewed on something. He wasn't chewing tobacco, just the inside of his cheek, the way men do when they're working through something they don't especially like. "I can't arrest a man for selling his sister on a public street. Not technically. There's no law in Wyoming territory that covers it specific." "I know," Elizabeth said. "What I can do is keep an eye on him. But he's been drinking heavy since July, and drinking men get notions. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." Donovan looked at Matthew. "You riding out with her?" "To the Palmer Ranch first, then Laramie." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Thomas has got a couple of friends, drifters he's been buying drinks for. I don't know their business exactly, but I know the type." He paused. "You planning to come back through Promise Creek?" Matthew met his eyes. "Depends on how things go." Donovan made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Fair enough." He looked at Elizabeth one more time, and his expression shifted, just for a moment, into something that might have been an apology for the limits of his jurisdiction. "You take care of yourself, Miss Palmer." "I always have," she said. It wasn't bravado. It was just the truth, stated plainly, and Donovan received it the way it was offered. He nodded once, stepped back, and let them go. She and Matthew walked to the livery in silence. The stable boy, a kid named Ferris, who couldn't have been more than 14, brought out her father's gray mare with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned not to ask questions about the moods of adults. Matthew's horse was already saddled, a dark bay gelding with the compact, road-hardened build of an animal that had covered serious distance. She checked the cinch on her saddle out of habit, adjusted the length of the left stirrup the way she always had to because her father had longer legs than she did, and she'd never gotten around to changing the tack permanently. "You know the way out to the Palmer spread?" Matthew asked. "I grew up there." He nodded, swung up onto the bay. She mounted the gray, and they rode out of Promise Creek without looking back. The ranch road was dry and rutted, cutting east through country that was flat and then gently rolling and then flat again, the kind of landscape that some people found bleak and that Elizabeth had always found honest. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. It was grass and sky and distance, and everything it offered plainly. She rode with the locket in her mind. Her mother's gold locket, small and slightly dented on one side where it had been dropped on a kitchen floor in 1869, the year Elizabeth turned 9. Inside it, a photograph of her mother and father on their wedding day, before Wyoming, before the hard years. She'd hidden it before Thomas could sell it, tucked it in the cedar chest under her mother's winter quilt, and she had been trying to get back there for 3 weeks while Thomas's unpredictability made the ranch too dangerous to visit alone. "You want to tell me what we're going into?" Matthew said. They'd been riding for 20 minutes in comfortable quiet, and his question came naturally, without pressure. "My brother's been spending time with some men, drifters, like the sheriff said. I don't know exactly what their arrangement is. But you've got to guess." She had several guesses, none of them good. "The land's mortgaged, Thomas can't pay Cutter, but the ranch hands are gone. He let them go in April, so what use does he have for men who know guns better than cattle?" Matthew absorbed this. "The house might not be empty." "I know." "You still want to go." "I need something from inside." She paused. "It's small. It won't take long." He didn't push for details. She had the growing impression that he operated on a fundamental respect for what people chose to share and what they didn't, and she was grateful for it in a way that she couldn't quite articulate yet. "If the house has men in it," he said, "we don't go in shooting. We assess first. Agreed?" "Agreed." "And if there's no clear opening, then I leave without it." She said it firmly, wanting to establish that she was not going to be one of those women who got a man killed over sentiment. Even though the thought of leaving without the locket made something in her chest tighten in a way that felt almost physical. "All right," Matthew said. The Palmer Ranch appeared on the horizon the way it always had. The roofline first, then the fence posts, then the general shape of the buildings pulling themselves out of the flatness of the plain. She'd ridden this approach 10,000 times. It had always felt like coming home. Now it felt like riding towards something she needed to be careful of, and the difference between those two feelings was sharp enough to cut. They slowed as they got closer. The yard was still. The barn door was open, which it shouldn't have been. One of the windows in the main house was dark, in a way that suggested the inside shutters had been pulled, which her father had never done during daylight hours. "Someone's here," Matthew said quietly. "Yes." They stopped 200 yards out. He studied the buildings with the methodical attention of someone reading a situation rather than just observing it. She studied them too, from a different set of memories. The angles of cover, the places she knew well enough to move through in the dark, the root cellar entrance around the backside of the house that Thomas had never found because their mother had always kept it hidden under a spread of climbing roses. "The back," she said. "There's a way in from the back that they won't know about." He looked at her. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough." He thought for a moment. "We tie the horses in the creek bed north of the fence line. Come in on foot from the north side." She nodded. Her heart was doing something complicated, but her hands on the reins were steady. Her mother had put a cast iron skillet in her hands when she was 8, and she had been building steadiness ever since. They turned north, and the ranch waited for them in the autumn silence, and the gray mare moved quiet and sure beneath her, and Elizabeth Palmer did not look away from what was ahead. They tied the horses in the creek bed the way Matthew had suggested, looping the reins around a pair of cottonwoods that grew close together where the bank curved. The gray mare settled immediately, dropping her head to crop at the dry grass along the waterline. The bay stood still and watched the middle distance with the alert patience of an animal that had been in enough tight situations to know that stillness was usually the right choice. Elizabeth pulled her coat tighter and moved up the creek bank on foot, staying low, using the line of the fence to break her silhouette. Matthew came behind her, and she was aware of him in the specific way she'd become aware of him over the past hour. Not anxiously, not with the self-consciousness she might have expected, but with the practical comfort of knowing there was someone behind her who was paying attention. The climbing roses her mother had planted were still there, gone wild now in a way that would have bothered her mother considerably, canes sprawling in every direction with the unchecked ambition of something that had been waiting for the gardener to stop coming. Elizabeth moved through them carefully, taking her time with the thorns. She'd grown up learning this path by feel in the dark, sneaking out to the barn on summer nights to check on foaling mares, because her father slept light and her mother slept deep, and there had always been one of them who had to be the one who got up. The root cellar door was exactly where it had always been, set at a shallow angle into the ground, painted green once and now mostly just weathered wood. She eased it open. The hinges were dry, and she lifted the door at the same time she pulled, which eliminated the squeal that would have been there otherwise. Her mother had shown her that too. Matthew touched her shoulder as she started down. She stopped. He was looking at the barn, his head tilted very slightly, the posture of someone listening to something she wasn't catching yet. She held herself still and opened her ears the way her father had taught her, not searching for a specific sound, but letting whatever was there come forward. Voices. Low from inside the barn. 2, maybe 3 men. She and Matthew looked at each other. He held up 3 fingers, questioning. She lifted her shoulders. Could be 3, could be 2. She wasn't sure enough to commit. He nodded and gestured toward the cellar. She went down. The root cellar smelled the way it always had, earth and old wood and the ghost of the vegetables that had been stored here over decades. Her mother had kept it impeccably organized, labeled crocks of preserves lined along the shelves, sacks of winter squash stacked by size. What was left now was a handful of empty shelves and a rusted canning pot someone had shoved into the corner, and the darkness was complete enough that she had to navigate by memory. The interior stair was 12 steps. The trapdoor at the top opened into the pantry, behind the tall hutch that had been in her mother's family before Wyoming, was a territory. She went up slowly, Matthew behind her, and lifted the trapdoor just enough to confirm the pantry was empty before she climbed through. The house had the specific silence of a place that was occupied but not inhabited. The silence of men who were present but not living in a space, just using it the way animals use a found shelter. There were dishes left on the table from what looked like a morning meal, a coat thrown over her father's chair, a smell of tobacco that didn't belong. Someone had moved the settle from its place by the window and not put it back. She hated that. The pettiness of the feeling surprised her. She was standing in her own house that her brother had mortgaged to a land shark, in the middle of attempting something that could get badly wrong. And what she was most immediately angry about was someone moving the furniture. Matthew stayed at the pantry door, watching the main room. She moved to her parents' bedroom, keeping to the edge of the floorboards the way she'd learned as a child. The center creaked, the edges held quiet. The cedar chest was under the window where it had always been. She opened it. The winter quilt was folded on top, and beneath it, wrapped in a piece of her mother's blue calico, was the locket. She picked it up without unwrapping it, just felt the small weight of it, and put it in her coat pocket and pressed her hand flat over the pocket for a moment. Then a door opened at the front of the house. She was back in the pantry doorway in 4 steps, pressing herself against the frame. Matthew had gone still in the way he went still, completely, without visible effort, as if stillness were simply his natural state and movement was the exception. The man who came in was not Thomas. He was younger, mid-20s, tall, with the lean and slightly restless energy of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and found indoor spaces confining. He went straight to the table, picked up a tin cup left from breakfast, and walked to the stove to check if there was any coffee left in the pot. There wasn't. He set the cup down with a small sound of displeasure and turned around. He saw Matthew. The half-second that followed was one of those moments that stretch themselves out. Elizabeth registered it from the pantry doorway with the particular clarity that fear produces, every detail sharp. The young man's hand moving toward his hip, Matthew already moving, crossing the room in 2 strides, getting inside the reach of the drawing arm before it could complete its arc. It wasn't a fight so much as a very fast resolution. Matthew caught the gun hand at the wrist, twisted, and the young man's face went white with pain. The gun came free. Matthew stepped behind him and got an arm across his throat, not crushing, just sufficient. And the young man stopped struggling with the pragmatic speed of someone who understood that struggling was making things worse. "How many outside?" Matthew said quietly. His voice was the same as it had been in the street in Promise Creek, calm, specific, without theatrics. The young man said nothing. Matthew's arm tightened slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you past what's necessary. How many outside?" "2, the young man said. His voice was strained. "In the barn. Thomas Palmer with them?" A pause. "No." "Where is he?" "I don't know. He rode out this morning before we got up." Elizabeth stepped out of the pantry doorway. The young man's eyes found her, and something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but the look of someone recalculating. "You're her," he said. "The sister." "I'm the one who grew up in this house," she said, "which makes me more entitled to be in it than you. What does Thomas have you here for?" He didn't answer that. His eyes went sideways, which was answer enough. "There anything in this house worth taking?" Matthew said. "Beyond what's already in motion with the land." The young man's jaw worked. "I don't know what Thomas's arrangement is with Cutter. I just know we were supposed to be here when—" He stopped. "When what?" Another pause, longer. Matthew's arm tightened again, fractionally. "When she came back," the young man said. "Thomas said she'd come back for something. Said we should hold her here until he got back." The room got quiet. Elizabeth heard that, really heard it, and felt the specific chill of understanding that her brother had anticipated her, had known she'd come back for the locket, or for something, and had laid a trap with the same lazy cunning that had always been his best quality and his worst. "He knew I'd come," she said. It wasn't a question. He figured. The young man had the grace to look something adjacent to uncomfortable. "He said you were stubborn about the place." Matthew looked at her over the young man's shoulder, She read the look. "We need to move," and nodded. "Is there rope in this house?" Matthew said. She went to the barn without thinking. No, not the barn. The tack room. She came back with a length of good leather cord her father had kept for mending harness, and Matthew trussed the young man's wrists behind him with the efficient practice of someone who'd done it before. Not cruelly, but with enough security that it would take time to work loose. He sat him down against the leg of the kitchen table. "You'll get loose eventually," Matthew told him. "Your friends in the barn will wonder where you went before that happens. So this is going to get sorted out one way or another, and I'd suggest that when it does, you give some thought to what Thomas Palmer's paying you versus what the situation is actually worth." The young man said nothing, but the expression on his face suggested the math was already occurring to him. They went back through the pantry, down the cellar stairs, out through the roses. Elizabeth's hands were steady, but her breathing was shorter than she wanted it to be, and she didn't speak until they were back at the creek bed and she had her hand on the gray mare's neck. "He set a trap," she said. "Yes. He knew I'd come back. He knows you." Matthew was checking his saddle with quick, practiced movements. "That's not nothing. It means you need to stop going where he expects you to go." She thought about that. The gray mare turned her head and pushed her nose briefly against Elizabeth's shoulder, which was exactly what her father's horses had always done, and which, at this particular moment, was nearly more than she could stand without her composure cracking. She pressed her lips together and didn't let it crack. "The two men in the barn," she said. "When they find him, they'll come looking, which is why we ride now." He was already mounted. "You have what you came for?" She touched her coat pocket. The locket was there, small and real and exactly what she'd needed it to be. "Yes." "Then let's go." They rode west first back toward Promise Creek, because the road to Laramie ran south out of town and cutting cross-country on ground. Neither of them knew well in the afternoon light was a worse calculation than the extra time. She rode hard, and Matthew matched her pace without comment, and the grass rolled away on either side of them in the long amber light of Wyoming October. It was 20 minutes later, with Promise Creek visible on the horizon, that they heard hoofbeats behind them. She didn't have to look. She felt it in the gray mare's ears, the slight rotation forward, the animal's own alertness communicating what sound confirmed a moment later. She looked then, and saw two riders coming out of the east, coming hard, a quarter-mile back and closing. "The barn," Matthew said. "Yes." "Can that mare run?" "She's older, but she knows this ground." Elizabeth gathered the reins. "She'll run." "Then run her." She did. The gray mare opened up with the kind of whole-body commitment that older horses sometimes produce when they understand the urgency isn't theatrical, not the controlled lope of an exercise run, but the real thing, full stride, the ground coming fast underneath. Matthew's bay pulled even with her and held it, and for a long stretch of flat ground they simply ran, and the wind came off the plains into her face cold and sharp, and behind them the hoofbeats stayed, not gaining, but not falling back either. The edge of town appeared. The water tower first, then the roof of the livery, then the shapes of buildings along the main street. "We don't want to bring this into town," Elizabeth said, pulling back slightly. "Agreed." Matthew scanned the terrain to the south. "There's a dry wash about 200 yards south of the road. You see it?" She saw it, the slightly sunken line in the flat ground, the scrub that grew along its edges. "Yes." "We cut for it. Come up on the far side of them." It wasn't a clean plan. It had the slightly improvised quality of decisions made at speed, which meant it would work or it wouldn't, and they'd know which one in about 90 seconds. They cut south together, pulling off the road and across open ground, and Elizabeth felt the gray mare respond to the change in direction without breaking stride, adjusting her footing across the rougher ground with the sure-footedness of an animal that had been running this country since she was a yearling. They dropped into the wash, and the following riders were briefly out of sight, and Matthew pulled up. "Here," he said. He had his rifle out of the scabbard, resting across the pommel. She looked at him. "Not to shoot them," he said, reading her look accurately. "To make a point." The two riders came over the slight rise and pulled up sharp when they found the wash in front of them. and Matthew and Elizabeth on the other side of it stopped, facing them, with Matthew's rifle resting very visibly across his saddle. The two men, she could see them clearly now, a pair that matched the type she'd assessed from the barn shadows earlier, drifters with the specific look of men who were comfortable with various kinds of work as long as it paid, looked at the rifle and then at Matthew and then at each other. "This is where you turn around," Matthew said. His voice carried easily across the 30 yards of wash between them. One of the men, the one on the left, stocky and dark-bearded, shifted his weight in the saddle. "Thomas Palmer's going to want to know. Thomas Palmer can come find out himself. You two have done what you were paid to do. You held the house. That's over now." Matthew's tone was reasonable, the tone of a man offering a sensible business proposition. "This doesn't need to be anything more than it already is." Darkbeard looked at his companion. The companion, a thin man on a roan horse with the experience-worn look of someone who'd been in enough of these moments to accurately evaluate them, was already reining his horse sideways, not quite turning back, but making the preliminary motion. "She's got something that belongs to Thomas," Darkbeard said. "She's got something that belonged to her mother," Elizabeth said. She hadn't planned to speak, but the claim made her jaw tighten in a way she couldn't leave uncontested. "If Thomas has a grievance about that, he can bring it to the sheriff." Darkbeard's lip curled slightly. The sheriff comment was, in his estimation, apparently amusing. But Thin Man on the roan had made his decision. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he'd gone from assessing to finished, and he put his horse's head around toward the east. "Come on, Briggs," he said. Darkbeard, Briggs, held his position for another moment, wanting to register that this was his choice, that he was leaving because he had decided to and not because the rifle suggested it. Then he turned his horse and they rode back east, and Elizabeth and Matthew watched them go until they'd crested the rise and disappeared. The silence that followed was the specific silence after something that had almost gone badly and hadn't, and Elizabeth sat in it for a moment without moving, letting her heart find its way back down to its regular location. "That'll hold until they find Thomas," Matthew said. "How long do you think?" "Depends where he is. Could be an hour, could be less." He slid the rifle back into the scabbard. "We should get moving." They rejoined the road south of town, bypassing Promise Creek entirely, picking up the Laramie Road where it branched off the main trail. The afternoon was sliding toward evening, the light going that flat golden color that made the Wyoming plains look almost gentle, which was a lie the landscape told regularly and that people kept believing. They rode for an hour before either of them spoke again. "How long have you been at the Rocking J?" she asked. The question came out of the comfortable quiet naturally, the way questions do when there's been enough shared difficulty to make conversation feel less like an obligation. "About 8 months." He was riding loose and easy, the bay setting a steady ground-covering pace. "Before that, I was in Colorado. Before that, New Mexico." "You move around a lot." "I do." "By choice?" He thought about that for a beat longer than she expected. "Mostly, there's work, and then the work runs out, and then there's somewhere else with work. It has a pattern to it." "Does it bother you, the pattern?" "Sometimes." He said it without making it larger than it was. "Gets quiet in a way that takes some getting used to." She understood that. The ranch had been quiet in a different way since her father died. Not peaceful quiet, but the heavy quiet of a place that used to have life in it and didn't anymore. "What's Cole Whitfield like?" she asked. "The owner." "Fair, demanding. He expects work done right, and he doesn't make a lot of speeches about it. He just expects it, and he's usually right to." Matthew paused. "He lost his wife 3 years ago. It changed him some, made him quieter." "What was she like?" "I never met her. The hands who were there before me say she was the one who kept the social end of things running. Dinner for the neighbors, that kind of thing. The ranch house has been short-staffed in that way since." Elizabeth nodded. She understood the shape of that, the specific gap that a woman leaves in a household's functioning, the kind of work that nobody names until it isn't being done anymore. "The hands," she said. "How many?" 7 full-time, 2 seasonal, good men mostly. Wiley Dunn's been there 15 years. He'll test you some to see if you're worth your salt, but he's not mean about it. A brief pause. Doc Hess, thought that's what they call him. He's not an actual doctor. He's been known to eat things that most people would consider pre-chewed. Don't take it as commentary on your cooking. She almost smiled at that. The almost smile surprised her. I'm a decent cook, she said. I figured. You figured, or you hoped? He glanced at her sideways. Both. They rode on as the light continued its long descent, and Promise Creek fell away behind them, and the country opened up into the wider plains that lay between town and Laramie, and Elizabeth Palmer rode with her hand pressed occasionally against her coat pocket where her mother's locket sat, and did not look back. The first stars were showing when they made camp at a spot Matthew knew, a flat ground near a small creek with good wood nearby, and enough natural cover to make a fire practical without advertising it too aggressively. He built the fire with the economy of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and she found that she was hungry for the first time in what felt like days. They had what they had. Dried meat from his saddlebag, hard biscuits she'd put in her own bag that morning, out of pure habit, coffee from a small tin he carried. It was not a meal anyone would have called adequate, but it was hot and it was enough, and she ate without complaint and he did the same. You should know, she said, after the coffee had been poured and the fire had settled into its steady working rhythm, that I'm not fragile. He looked up. I know today looked like... She stopped, started again. I know what it looked like. Woman in the street with a price on her, woman who needs rescuing from her own family home. She held her cup in both hands. I'm not asking you to adjust your opinion of me. I'm just telling you that I've been running a ranch house since I was 14, and I nursed my father through 2 winters of illness, and I've been handling Thomas in one way or another for as long as I can remember. Today was a bad day, not a representation of my general condition. Matthew was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped. I didn't think you were fragile, he said. You don't know me well enough to think anything. I know you didn't panic in that house. I know when your brother's men came at us on the road, you didn't wait for me to make the decision. You ran the mare before I finished saying to. I know you're sitting here eating dried meat and hard biscuits without a word about it. He looked at her steadily. Those are things I know. She didn't have an answer to that. She looked into the fire instead, and he let her look. Get some sleep, he said after a while. We'll be in Laramie by early afternoon tomorrow if we start at first light. She rolled her coat into something that approximated a pillow and lay down on the hard ground, and the stars above Wyoming were enormous and indifferent the way they always were, and the locket was in her pocket against her ribs. And somewhere behind her, Thomas Palmer was going to find out she'd come and gone and left one of his men tied to a kitchen table. She should have been afraid of that. She was, a little. But she was also, for the first time in 6 months, on her way somewhere. The weeks after Thomas's visit settled into something Elizabeth hadn't expected. Not peace exactly, but the functional rhythm of a place that had work to do and did it. The rocking J ran on that rhythm the way a clock runs on its spring, everything calibrated to the movement of cattle and weather and the shortening of days as November pushed in from the north. She found her footing in the kitchen and then beyond it. The first time she walked out to the barn without being asked, because she'd seen from the kitchen window that one of the younger hands, a boy named Cale, 17 and earnest in the specific way of boys who are trying very hard to appear otherwise, was struggling with a horse that had gotten a stone bruise and was moving wrong and needed someone to talk it down before it hurt itself worse. She did it without thinking about whether it was her place. She just went. She got the horse quiet, checked the hoof, told Cale what needed doing. Wiley Dunn watched this from the barn door with his arms crossed. He didn't say anything. The next morning, the biscuits were on the table, and so was a small pot of sourwood honey that she hadn't asked for and hadn't known was in the pantry. She looked at it. She looked at Wiley, who was already eating and not looking at her. She put honey on a biscuit and said nothing, and that was how that was settled. Cole Whitfield noticed things without appearing to notice them, which she was coming to understand was simply how he operated. He came into the kitchen one afternoon in mid-November and set a ledger on the corner of the table without preamble. Ranch accounts, he said. I've been doing them myself since Margaret died. I'm not bad at it, but I'm not good at it either, and I don't have the time I used to. He looked at her directly. Matthew says your father ran a ranch. He did, I kept the books from the time I was 16. Then you know what you're looking at. I do. He nodded and left the ledger. She sat down with it after supper and worked through 3 months of entries, found 2 accounting errors and 1 category of expenditure that had been miscoded consistently and was skewing the feed cost numbers, and left the corrected version on the corner of his desk with a short note explaining what she'd found. He didn't mention it the next day or the day after. On the 3rd day, he increased her pay by $4 a month and told her the ledger work was hers if she wanted it. She said she'd take it. She still didn't know what to do with Matthew Morgan, which was its own ongoing situation. She was aware of him constantly, in the way you become aware of a sound that's always been there once you've identified it. Not intrusively, but as a constant feature of the environment. He was at breakfast and supper. He rode out in the mornings in the particular direction that the day's work required, and came back with the particular quality of tiredness that real physical work produces, different from the wasted tiredness of men who drink or worry. He was easy with the hands in a way that didn't require him to be loud about it, just present, just paying attention. He had a habit, she noticed, of checking things other people had already checked. Not from distrust, it wasn't surveillance, it wasn't control, but from the ingrained caution of a man who had spent years in situations where overlooking a thing could cost you significantly. He'd checked the cinches on saddles that Cale had already tightened. He'd walked the fence line that Wiley's crew had already walked. He did it without comment, and if he found something wrong, he fixed it without making an event of it. And if he found nothing wrong, he said nothing about having checked. She recognized that quality. Her father had had it. She had it herself. The compulsive verification of things that mattered, the inability to take done for done until she'd confirmed it with her own hands. It was not, she understood, the most restful way to move through the world, but it was reliable. She was 3 weeks into the ledger work when Doc Hess came into the kitchen before breakfast with his hat in his hands and told her that riders from the Callahan spread east of Laramie had passed through the night before with news. The Callahan's north pasture fence had been cut and 11 head run off, and the tracks left behind weren't the tracks of casual thieves. Organized, Hess said. That's what Callahan's foreman told us. Not just a couple of men looking for an easy score. This was planned. She set the coffee pot down. How many head does Callahan run? Near 300, but it's not just him. There's been 3 ranches hit in the last 6 weeks. Harker's place up toward the state line, the Double D south of here, and now Callahan. He turned his hat over in his hands. Matthew's going to want to know. She already knew Matthew knew. She could tell by the change in the yard that morning, a quality of focused attention among the hands that was different from the ordinary attention of a workday, the way you can feel a shift in weather before it actually arrives. Matthew was at the corral fence with Whitfield and Wiley, all 3 of them close together and quiet, which meant the conversation was serious. Whitfield called the full crew together after breakfast. He stood in the yard in his coat and hat with the particular authority of a man who owns the ground he's standing on and knows it. You've heard about Callahan, he said, and Harker, and the Double D. He looked around at the assembled faces. 9 men, Doc Hess, young Cale, the others, all of them with the same alert stillness. The Rocking J runs 260 head in the north pasture right now, another 140 south. We are not going to lose cattle. What that means is night watch doubled, starting tonight. Matthew will work out the rotations. He paused. Any man who doesn't want to pull the extra hours can say so now and ride out. No hard feelings. Nobody said so. Nobody rode out. She watched this from the porch and felt something she hadn't expected. A kind of loyalty to this place, to these people, that had assembled itself quietly over the weeks without her noticing it coming. It wasn't the loyalty of blood, which she'd learned the hard way was not a guarantee of anything worth having. It was the loyalty of shared work and shared table and the accumulation of small, reliable things, which turned out to be a different and in some ways more solid kind. Matthew caught her eye briefly as the crew dispersed. Just briefly. Just enough. The night watches started. She began getting up at 2 a.m. to have coffee and something hot ready when the crew rotated. It wasn't asked of her, it wasn't expected, but she did it because she understood that men riding in cold at that hour needed something waiting for them, and she was there and she could provide it. Whitfield found her in the kitchen at 2:30 one night and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. He poured himself a cup and sat at the kitchen table, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that people can be quiet together when they've established enough mutual respect for the silence to be comfortable rather than awkward. Matthew thinks they'll hit us, Whitfield said, within the next 2 weeks. Does he know something specific? He knows the pattern. Harker, Callahan, the double D. They form a loose triangle. The rocking J's in the center of it. He turned his cup in his hands. Someone's been planning this for a while. Not just picking ranches at random. She thought about that. About the kind of planning that required. The maps, the timing, the logistics of running stolen cattle far enough and fast enough to make them disappear. Do you know who? Not yet. He looked at his cup. Matthew has some ideas. He hasn't said all of them out loud. She didn't push. She understood that there were conversations happening between Whitfield and Matthew that she wasn't part of yet, and that being new to a place meant that even when you'd established yourself, there were circles you hadn't been invited into, and the right response to that was patience rather than resentment. She refilled his cup without being asked, and he nodded, and they sat with the Wyoming night pressing against the kitchen windows until the first of the returning night riders came in from the cold. The attack on the Rocking J came on a Thursday night, 11 days into the doubled watch schedule. She was asleep, genuinely asleep, not the light suspended sleep she'd been managing since the watches started, when the sound pulled her up. Not gunfire yet, just horses. Too many horses for the time of night, moving at a speed that was wrong. She was out of bed and dressed in under 2 minutes, which was something her mother had insisted on. Always sleep in clothes you can move in, you never know. And had her boots on and was in the kitchen when the first shot came from the direction of the north pasture. The kitchen window showed her the yard. Dark shapes moving, the barn lantern swinging, Wiley coming out of the bunkhouse with his rifle, 2 of the hands behind him. She couldn't see Matthew. The firing was from the north, irregular, which meant it wasn't a coordinated volley. Individuals shooting at moving targets in the dark, which was bad accuracy and good chaos. She heard cattle. The specific alarm sound of a herd that has been deliberately startled, the rumble of feet that shouldn't be moving. She went to the gun cabinet in Whitfield's office. She'd noted it on her second day because she noted things like that, where the important things were in a new space, and Whitfield hadn't locked it, which told her something about his general management philosophy. She took the shotgun. She knew shotguns, had used them since she was 12, and loaded it from the shells on the shelf below and went back to the kitchen door. Whitfield was in the yard now, moving toward the barn. He saw her in the doorway. "Get back inside, Charat," he said. "How many?" He stopped. He was angry. She could see it. But he was also someone who processed information before acting on his feelings about it, which was what made him worth listening to. "We don't know. 6, maybe more. They've pushed the north fence and they're trying to split the herd." "Is Matthew out there?" "He was first out." A pause that told her more than the words. "He went north." She stayed in the doorway. The firing continued, irregular bursts, and she could track the movement of it. North pasture, then shifting east, which meant someone was trying to outflank the riders who'd gone to meet them. She knew this landscape now. 3 weeks of daily orientation had given her the shape of it, where the terrain broke and where it opened and where a man on a horse could get cut off. Young Cale came running back from the north, his horse barely controlled, his face white. He pulled up near the kitchen porch and she could see he'd been grazed. His left arm, the jacket sleeve dark and wet. "Cale." She was off the porch before she decided to move. "Stop. Stop the horse." He looked at her with the disoriented expression of someone who has been frightened out of coherent thought. She caught the bridle, got the horse still. "How bad?" she said. "I don't—" He looked at his arm as if seeing it for the first time. "It just burned. I don't think it—" "Get down." She kept her voice even, the way you keep your voice even with a frightened animal, because that's what he was right now. A frightened animal who needed something stable to respond to. He got down. She walked him to the porch and looked at the arm in the light from the kitchen window. Graze, not embedded. It was bleeding steadily and would need cleaning and binding, but it wasn't going to kill him. "Sit here," she said. "Don't move." She went inside, got the medicine box from the shelf by the pantry, where she'd put it on the first week because she'd noted it wasn't in a sensible location, came back and worked on Cale's arm with the systematic efficiency of someone who had dealt with ranch injuries since childhood. He hissed when the whiskey went on. She didn't apologize for it. "Matthew," she said while she rapped, "did you see him?" "He was holding the east side of the north fence," Cale said. "There were 3 of them, rustlers, and he was—" He stopped. "And he was what?" "He was doing all right when I lost him, but there were 3 of them." She tied off the bandage and told Cale to stay on the porch and not be a hero, and then she picked up the shotgun and walked toward the north pasture. She heard Whitfield shout something behind her. She kept walking. The north fence was 200 yards from the house. She covered the ground at a pace that was fast without being reckless, keeping to the fence line for orientation, letting the sounds guide her. The cattle had moved east and the firing was down to scattered single shots now, which either meant the fight was resolving or it had resolved in the wrong direction. She found Matthew at the break in the fence. He was down, not unconscious. He was trying to get up with the focused, grinding effort of a man whose body has stopped cooperating and hasn't yet informed his intentions. And there were 2 men on the ground near him who were not trying to get up at all. The third of Cale's 3 was gone, mounted and riding east by the sound of it. She was beside him before she'd processed the decision to be there. "Where?" she said. "Side." His jaw was tight. "Left side." "I'm all right." "You're on the ground." "I'm getting up." "You're bleeding through your coat." He looked at her then. Really looked at her, the way he looked at things when he was assessing rather than dismissing, and said, "Where'd you get the shotgun?" "Whitfield's cabinet." She got her arm under his right shoulder. He was heavier than he looked, which was true of men who were actually solid as opposed to appearing to be. "Can you stand?" "Yes." He stood with her help, and she felt him absorb the pain of it without making more of it than was necessary, which was exactly the kind of stoicism that she found both admirable and infuriating in equal measure. They got back to the house. The firing had stopped completely by then, and she could hear Whitfield's voice from the direction of the north pasture. The tone of authority doing inventory, assessing what had happened and what had been lost. She got Matthew into the kitchen and into a chair and got his coat off, which required some cooperation and some stubbornness from both of them before it came clear. The wound was in his left side, below the ribs. A bullet that had gone in, and she confirmed with a pressure of her fingers that made him pull a sharp breath, had gone out the back. Through and through. Serious, painful, survivable if she handled it correctly. "I need to clean this," she said. "I know. It's going to be bad." "I know that too." She worked. She'd seen a bullet wound once before, when one of her father's hands had had an accident with his own rifle, and she'd watched what was done and filed it because that was how she operated, filing things that might matter later. She cleaned the entry and exit with whiskey, packed both with clean cloth, bound it tight. Matthew held himself still throughout with a controlled intensity that told her exactly how much it cost him to hold still. When it was done, she sat back and looked at him. His face was gray under the weathering, and he was sweating, and his left hand was gripping the edge of the table in a way that left white marks on his knuckles. But he was looking at her with something in his eyes that she didn't immediately have a name for. "Good hands," he said. It wasn't a compliment about her kitchen work. She felt something shift. Not dramatically, not with any of the theater that she'd always associated with the idea of feelings of this kind, but quietly and with a kind of settled certainty, the way a thing that has been almost true for a while becomes simply true. She said, "You're going to need to stay still for several days. I've got cattle to... The cattle will be managed. You will stay still." He looked at her. "You giving me orders?" "I'm giving you information about what's going to happen." She held his gaze. "You can interpret it however you want." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a full smile she'd ever seen from him, and it arrived and departed quickly, which made her want to see it again, which was information she filed without acting on. Whitfield came in 20 minutes later with Wiley behind him. The damage report, 8 head taken, the north fence broken in 2 places, one of the attacking riders down, and 2 escaped. The rider who was down was not one of their own. one of the rustlers, who had made the miscalculation of assuming that a ranch whose regular hands had been watching the northern approach for 11 nights would have gotten tired of watching. "The two who got away," Whitfield said, looking at Matthew. "You recognize them?" Matthew shook his head. "Didn't get a look at faces, but the way they worked, coordinated, knew where the fence breaks were." He paused. "Someone gave them a layout of this place." The kitchen was quiet. "Someone who knew the ranch," Wiley said. He said it the way Wiley said most things, flatly, without decoration, just the facts set down in front of everyone to look at. "Or someone who knew the area well enough to scope it," Matthew said. "Or someone who was told by someone who knew." She was listening and thinking about Thomas Palmer and his two men, and his certain knowledge that she'd gone to the Rocking J, and the calculation he'd made in the yard 3 weeks ago when he'd looked at Matthew and said, "This isn't finished." She thought about the triangle Whitfield had described: Harker, Callahan, the Double D, and the Rocking J at the center. She thought about a man with gambling debts and a mortgaged ranch and nothing left to lose, and a connection to drifters who moved through frontier country doing whatever work presented itself. She didn't say it yet. She wasn't certain enough, and she'd learned, from her father, from years of watching things carefully, that saying a thing before you were certain enough just muddied the water and made the certain knowing harder to reach. But she thought it. Whitfield sent 2 hands to Laramie at first light to report to the sheriff there, a man named Greer, who had jurisdiction over the surrounding range country and more resources than Donovan in Promise Creek. She packed them provisions for the ride and stood on the porch and watched them go, and the morning was cold and clear and very bright, the way Wyoming mornings are sometimes in November when the sky decides to be generous. Matthew was in the spare room, the one across the hall from the kitchen, not hers, a room usually used for storage that Whitfield had quietly cleared out the night before, under orders to remain horizontal. She checked on him at mid-morning, brought him coffee and something to eat, sat in the chair by the window while he ate. "You didn't go back inside," he said, "when Whitfield told you to." "No." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because going back inside would have meant waiting to find out what happened to you, and I couldn't do that." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a considerable thing to say." "I know what it is." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the yard in Promise Creek, waiting, giving her the space of the question without pressure. It was the same quality that had distinguished him from the first moment, the specific patience of someone who understood that people needed room. "You're the first person since my father," she said, "that I've trusted to be where they said they'd be." The room was very quiet. Outside, the Rocking J went about its morning, the sound of the yard, the cattle in the distance, the ordinary machinery of a working place doing what it did regardless of what happened inside the walls. She'd come to find that sound reassuring in a way she hadn't predicted, the way you find reassuring any steady thing. Matthew put the coffee cup down carefully, as if it required his full attention. "Elizabeth," he said, "you don't have to say anything." "I know I don't." He met her eyes. "I want to." She waited. "I've moved around a lot," he said. "You know that, and I've told myself that was practical. Work runs out. You go where work is. And that's true as far as it goes," he paused. "But things that are true as far as they go are not always the whole truth." She understood that. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had also told themselves practical stories about their own life and had recently had occasion to examine whether those stories were complete. "I've been at the Rocking J 8 months, he said, "and I haven't once thought about where the next place might be. That's new." He looked at her steadily. "You've been here 7 weeks and it hasn't changed. That's new too." She held his gaze and felt the shift that had started in the kitchen the night before complete itself. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the settling of something into its right place the way a bone sets after it's been displaced, with some pain involved, but with the fundamental rightness of the correct position asserting itself. "You need to rest," she said. "I know. I'll come back at noon." "I'll be here," he said. And then quietly, "I plan to keep being here." She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the yard, at the Rocking J in its late November light, at the land that she had not been born to but had come to by the specific route of her own choices and her own refusals, and a stranger who had ridden into Promise Creek on a day that had started badly and ended somewhere she couldn't have predicted. She put sage in the cornbread because it was right. She started a pot of broth because Matthew needed it. She took out the ledger because the accounts weren't going to balance themselves. And she had work to do, and the work was hers, and she did it. Sheriff Greer arrived from Laramie on the second day after the raid, riding in with a deputy and the particular no-nonsense bearing of a man who had been doing range law for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by most of what human beings did to each other and each other's cattle. He was a tall man, angular, with a gray mustache and the deliberate speech of someone who had learned that saying things slowly and precisely saved considerable time compared to saying them fast and having to repeat them. He sat at Whitfield's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and listened to everything without interrupting, which Elizabeth noted and respected. "The 3 ranches before you," Greer said when Whitfield finished. "Harker, Callahan, the Double D. None of them got a look at the men involved." "We got a look at one," Matthew said. He was sitting at the table too, upright, which she'd told him not to do yet, and he'd done it anyway, which she'd expected. He was pale and moving with the careful economy of someone managing pain, but his thinking was clear and she knew better than to try to move him back to the spare room until the sheriff had what he needed. "I didn't recognize him, but the operation, the way they cut the fence, the way they split the herd, the fact that they knew where the fence breaks were before they cut them, someone planned this specific to this ranch." Greer looked at him. "You're saying they had information about the layout. I'm saying they moved like they'd been here before or been told by someone who had." There was a silence. Elizabeth set the coffee pot down and looked at Greer directly. "My brother is Thomas Palmer. He was at this ranch 3 weeks ago, uninvited, with 2 men. Mr. Whitfield asked him to leave." She paused. "Before that, he had men staying at the Palmer Ranch outside Promise Creek. Men he was paying for something. I don't know exactly what." Greer looked at her with the measured attention of a man recalibrating. "Palmer. James Palmer's outfit?" "Yes." "I knew your father some." He said it without making more of it, just the plain acknowledgement. "Your brother's been in some debt trouble. Significant debt trouble. With Cutter at the land office." "Yes." Greer turned his cup slowly on the table. "Cutter," he said, in the tone of a man for whom that name carried specific freight. Whitfield leaned forward. "You know him?" "I know of him. The land office in Promise Creek has been the subject of some complaint. There's a pattern there. Ranches in financial trouble, land acquired for back taxes or debt, titles transferred faster than the law comfortably allow." He paused. "I haven't been able to make a case stick because the men I'd need to talk to have generally decided to be somewhere else when I'm looking for them." The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. "Thomas wouldn't know how to plan something like this on his own," Elizabeth said. She said it without sentiment, just as the factual assessment it was. "He drinks, and he's reckless, and he's angry, but he's not organized. Someone organized him." Greer looked at her. "Cutter." "That would be my thinking." "Same thinking I've been having for about 8 months, Greer said. "What I've been missing is something solid enough to act on." He set his cup down. "If your brother's connected to these raids, even as a hired piece of it, even if Cutter's the one running the operation, that's something I can work with." He looked at Matthew. "The man who went down in the north pasture. He's at your barn?" "He is," Whitfield said. "I'd like to see him." They went out to the barn together. Greer, his deputy, Whitfield, and Matthew, who moved with the controlled gait of someone who has decided that managing pain is preferable to the alternative of not being present. Elizabeth stayed in the kitchen and thought. She thought about Thomas and what she knew about him and what she'd been avoiding knowing. She thought about the man he'd been when they were young. Not kind exactly, but present, not this, not the thing he'd become. She didn't know at what precise point the drinking had overtaken the person underneath it, or whether the person underneath had been the problem all along, and the drinking had just been the mechanism. She'd been trying to work that out for years, and had reached no conclusive answer, which was maybe the honest truth of it, that some people's unraveling doesn't have a single clean cause, that it's the accumulation of small choices and character and bad luck in a proportion you can't entirely assign blame to. None of that changed what had to happen. Greer came back inside an hour later. The man in the barn had talked, which Greer relayed with the flat satisfaction of someone whose profession requires patience and for whom patience occasionally produced results. "His name's Arlo Briggs," Greer said. "The one your man ran off on the road from Promise Creek. That was his brother. He says they were hired through a man named Decker who runs errands for Cutter's operation. Thomas Palmer approached Decker about 6 weeks ago with the layout of the Rocking Jay and information about 3 other ranches he knew from the county." He paused. "Your brother didn't organize this, but he fed it." Elizabeth absorbed this. She'd known it, or known something close to it, but knowing a thing and having it confirmed by a stranger with a badge were different experiences, and she gave herself a moment to let them align. "What does this mean for him?" she said. Greer looked at her with the direct but not unkind gaze of a man who was about to deliver something difficult. "It means I need to find him and bring him in. What happens after that is up to the court." He paused. "I won't insult you by saying I'm sorry, but I will say that what your brother did to you in Promise Creek, before any of this, was enough to answer the question of whether you owe him loyalty in this situation." "I'm not protecting him," she said. "I wasn't going to." "I know." He picked up his hat. "Do you know where he might be?" She thought, if he's not at the Palmer Ranch, and he may not be, if Cutter's men are moving around, he drinks at a place called the River Bend Saloon 2 miles outside Promise Creek. He's been going there since before my father died. The owner's a man named Hatch, who runs a tab for men he thinks are worth the risk. "Hatch," Greer said. "I know that place." He put his hat on. "I'll ride back through Promise Creek on the way home." He and the deputy rode out before noon, and the Rocking Jay settled back into its working quiet, which was different from the quiet before the raid. Not more anxious exactly, but more conscious, as though the ranch had become aware of itself in a new way. Matthew rested for 4 days, which was 3 more than he wanted and 1 fewer than she'd prescribed, and on the 5th day she found him in the yard assessing the repaired fence line from the horse's back, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him and said nothing. Because the argument had already happened in her head, and she'd lost it, and there was no point repeating things that hadn't worked the first time. He came in for coffee, and she poured it without comment, and he sat at the kitchen table and looked at her with the steady directness that she'd come to understand was simply how he inhabited his own face. Not a performance, not a strategy, just the way his attention moved through the world. "You're angry," he said. "I told you 5 days." "You did." "And you went out on day 4. "I went out on day 4.5, he said. "I counted." She sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet, and the morning light was coming through the east window, and she was aware of a feeling that she didn't entirely trust yet, because she'd spent 6 months learning that the things she'd been counting on were not as solid as she'd believed, and recalibrating trust was not something that happened quickly or without resistance. "Matthew?" she said. "Yes. I need to know something." He waited. He was good at waiting. "When this is settled," she said, "when Greer has Thomas and Cutter's operation is dealt with, and the cattle situation is resolved, and everything that's currently in motion has finished moving, what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he didn't answer quickly, that he took the question seriously enough to think about it rather than offering the first comfortable thing that came to hand. "I told you I haven't thought about leaving," he said. "That's still true." "That's not quite what I asked." "No." He looked at her. "What I want is to be somewhere that I'm useful, with work that matters, with—" He stopped. Started again. "I've spent a lot of years in motion, and I've gotten good at it, and I've told myself that being good at something is the same as it being right for you, and I'm not sure that's true anymore." "What changed?" He held her gaze. "You know what changed." She did. She'd known for a while. The knowing had been building with the particular patience of things that are real and don't need to announce themselves, and it had been sitting in the room between them for weeks now, solid and unambiguous, and waiting for one of them to simply acknowledge it out loud. "I'm not easy to know," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm not shy about them, and I keep accounts of things in my head that I probably should let go of, and I've spent 6 months being afraid in a way that I think has made me harder than I used to be." I know, he said. You've been here 7 weeks. You don't know that. Elizabeth. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, with the focused attention he brought to anything he was taking seriously. I know you rechecked the cinch on your own saddle the morning after I'd already checked it. I know you keep the ledger balanced to the cent because half-cent errors bother you the same as $10 ones. I know you got up at 2 in the morning for 11 nights in a row because you decided the men on watch needed something warm, and you didn't mention it to anyone, and you wouldn't have mentioned it if Whitfield hadn't happened to come into the kitchen. He paused. I know what kind of person those things add up to, and I'm telling you it's the kind I'm not going anywhere from. The kitchen was very quiet. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right? All right. She stood up and took his coffee cup. Finish resting today. Tomorrow you can check whatever fence you want. He watched her move back to the stove. She didn't look at him, but she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him. The specific, particular, entirely unignorable awareness of a person who has become necessary. Greer found Thomas 4 days later at the Riverbend Saloon, exactly where Elizabeth had said he'd be, sitting at a table in the back with a bottle he'd mostly finished, and the sunken, unfocused look of a man who has run out of forward motion and is waiting for something to tell him what to do next. He went without much resistance, which Greer noted in his report as consistent with a man who had run out of reasons to fight. She heard about it through the letter Greer sent to Whitfield, delivered by a rider from Laramie on a cold December morning. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee and felt something that was not grief and not relief and not satisfaction, something that didn't have a clean name, which was probably accurate because the ending of complicated things rarely produces clean feelings. Thomas had confirmed Decker's role. Decker had, when faced with the alternative, confirmed Cutter's. Cutter was arrested in Promise Creek by Donovan, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence for longer than he'd admitted to anyone, and who accomplished the arrest with the quiet efficiency of a man completing unfinished business. 3 other men connected to the rustling operation were picked up over the following 2 weeks across a range of territory that suggested Cutter had been running the scheme for considerably longer than the 6 weeks that had directly affected the Rocking J. The Palmer Ranch, which had been mortgaged to Cutter, and was therefore now part of an active criminal case, would be held in a kind of legal suspension until the court sorted out what belonged to whom. Elizabeth read that part twice. She didn't know yet what it meant for the 40 acres where she'd grown up, and she told herself she didn't need to know right now, that some things needed time to settle before you could see their true shape. She put the letter on Whitfield's desk and went back to the kitchen and made bread. Thomas was tried in January, in a Laramie courtroom that Elizabeth did not attend. Matthew offered to ride with her if she wanted to go. She thought about it for 2 days, genuinely thought about it, which was more consideration than most people probably would have given it. No, she said finally. I don't need to see it. Matthew nodded. I already know how it ends, she said. He made choices, and they have a cost, and the cost is going to be paid. I don't need to watch the pain to understand that it happened. Some people need the seeing, Matthew said. I know, I don't think I'm one of them. She paused. I think watching it would just... She stopped, started again. I spent 6 months watching Thomas destroy things. The ranch himself, the idea I had of him from when we were children, I've watched enough. Matthew looked at her. You had an idea of him from when you were children. Everyone has an idea of their family from when they were children. It doesn't mean the idea was right. It just means it was formed before you were old enough to see clearly. She looked down at her hands, which were floury from the bread. He wasn't always like this? Or maybe he was always moving toward this and I couldn't see the direction until it was already arrived. I don't know which one is true, and I've stopped expecting to find out. It might be both, Matthew said. It might be. She looked up at him. That's the hardest kind of thing to carry, the ones that don't resolve into a single answer. He was quiet for a moment. You're not carrying it wrong. She didn't know exactly what to do with that, so she went back to the bread, and he went back to whatever the afternoon required of him, and outside the kitchen window the December Wyoming sky was doing something complicated with clouds and light that would have been beautiful if she'd had more time to look at it. Thomas received 3 years. Greer relayed it by letter. She read the number and put the letter down and sat with it for a while. 3 years was not nothing. It was also not the rest of his life, and she wasn't sure what to do with the fact that she didn't know how she felt about that. Whether she wanted it to be longer or whether she just wanted it to be over, and 3 years was the version of over that had been assigned. She filed it in the category of things she'd given sufficient thought to and was putting down. There was a limit to how long you could profitably think about something that was out of your control, and she'd learned to locate that limit and respect it. December became January. The rocking J settled into the deep quiet of real winter, the kind that reduced the world to what was directly in front of you: the cattle, the feed, the fence, the stove, the roof. She had grown up in this climate and had a physical understanding of it, the way your body knows a thing that your mind can only approximate. She knew how cold manifested before a storm, the specific quality of stillness before the wind, the way cattle moved when weather was building. These were her father's lessons, embedded deep enough to be instinct. She also knew, by January, that she was happy. She held that knowledge with some care, the way you hold something that has been damaged before and might be again, not fearfully, but with appropriate respect for its history. She'd been happy before in her life, and she'd had it taken, and that experience had left her with a tendency to check the thing she was holding to make sure it was still there, which was probably a habit she'd carry for a long time. But the checking kept coming back with the same answer, and the same answer repeated enough times starts to become something you can rely on. Matthew had recovered fully by February, Schwartz. She confirmed this through observation rather than his self-report, since his self-report on matters of physical condition was consistently optimistic to the point of unreliability. He moved right. He worked a full day without compensation. The careful economy of someone managing pain was gone from how he carried himself, replaced by the ordinary economy of someone who simply doesn't waste motion. He asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon in the first week of February, which was something they had done occasionally through December and January when the weather permitted. Not formally, not with any explicit agenda, just the accumulated habit of two people who had arrived at enjoying each other's company and didn't need to make a production of it. They walked the fence line east of the barn, which was a walk they'd done before, and which took them past the spot where the north fence had been cut in November. The repair was solid. Matthew's work, done while she'd been telling him to rest and he'd been pretending to, and the snow around it was clean and undisturbed. "Whitfield talked to me yesterday," Matthew said. She waited. "He wants to expand the north pasture. There's another 80 acres adjacent that he's had an option on for 2 years but hasn't moved on. He said," he paused, "he said he'd been waiting until he had the right people to run it." She looked at him. Right people. "He was somewhat less direct than I'm being right now," Matthew said. "It took about 20 minutes to communicate what I've just said in 30 seconds, but that was the substance." "He's offering you a foreman's stake?" "He's offering us a foreman's stake." He said it simply, without making it larger than it needed to be. "Both of us. A partnership arrangement, his terms are fair, I've already read them. The house on the north side of the property that's been sitting empty since his wife's brother left in '73 would be ours to use and eventually to own as part of the arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm telling you what's been offered and what I'd like. And what I'd like is—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again. "That's my answer." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read over these months. The one that meant he was taking something seriously, that he was receiving it with the full weight it deserved. "You didn't let me finish." "I know what you were going to say." "You might be wrong." "I'm not wrong." She held his gaze. "You were going to tell me what you'd like, and what you'd like involves both of us, and the north pasture and the empty house, and the answer is yes." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the February light on his face, the way it caught in the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into western sun. He was not a handsome man in any classical sense. He was weathered and lean and had a jaw that was slightly too angular and a nose that had been broken at some point and healed in a direction that was close to straight, but not quite. He was, in all the ways that mattered to her, exactly right. "You're sure?" he said, not doubting her, just honoring the weight of it. Matthew. She turned fully toward him. I left a place where someone tried to sell me like property. I traveled through country where my brother had set a trap for me. I came to a ranch full of strangers with nothing but a tin locket and what I knew how to do, and I built something here. I did not do all of that to be uncertain about what I want. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I plan to marry you. I know. When you're ready. I'm ready now, but spring would be a better time for it. The ground's too hard for a wedding in February. He almost laughed. She'd made him almost laugh before. That quick, surprised almost laugh that she suspected he hadn't used much before he came to the rocking J. And each time it arrived, she found she wanted to make it happen again. Spring, he agreed. They walked back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, and the snow crunched under their boots, and the rocking J sat in its winter stillness ahead of them, smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight up in the cold air. And it was hers, and it was his, and it was theirs, and she had gotten here by the specific route of refusing to be something someone else decided she was. The wedding was in April, when the ground was soft and the first green had started to show in the pastures, and the rocking J looked like what it was, a working ranch in a good season, solid and unpretty and absolutely real. Wiley Dunn wore his good coat, which apparently existed, though no one had seen it before. Doc Hess cried, which surprised everyone including Doc Hess. Young Cale stood very straight and serious, which was his way of expressing that something mattered. Whitfield stood to the side with his arms crossed, and the particular expression of a man who is satisfied with how something has turned out and is too private to say so directly. Elizabeth wore her mother's locket. It was the only thing that needed to be said about that. The years that followed were not easy years. She would have been suspicious of easy years, would have wondered what was coming to compensate for them. They were good years, which is different and in many ways better. Good years contain their own difficulties, their own losses, their own days when everything that can go wrong does go wrong before noon, and you have to make a decision about whether to fight it or outlast it. Good years don't exempt you from winter or bad prices or cattle that get sick despite every precaution. What good years give you is the people to weather those things with, and the place to come back to, and the knowledge, built slowly, the only way it gets built, that you are capable of more than you thought you were before you had to find out. The north pasture expanded. The empty house became full. The rocking Jay's reputation in the territory grew in the specific way that reputations grow when they're based on consistent work rather than on performance, gradually and without fanfare, and in such a way that after a while people simply assumed it had always been that way, which was one of the ways that real things announce themselves. She had children, 2, a boy and a girl, in that order, both of whom were born in the house on the north side of the property, and both of whom were put to work as soon as they were old enough to hold something without dropping it. She taught them what her mother had taught her about cold water in the morning, and what her father had taught her about checking things twice, and what she had learned herself about the difference between the life that's handed to you and the life you actually make. Thomas served his 3 years and was released, and she heard through Greer that he had gone east, which was all she heard and all she asked for. She didn't know if he ever stopped drinking or if he found something in himself that turned out to be worth building on. She hoped he had. She hoped it genuinely, without performance, without the complicated ambivalence she'd expected to feel about it. That surprised her. The simplicity of the hoping. She'd spent so long being afraid of him and then being angry at him that she'd expected the residue to be more tangled. What she found, in the end, was that the people who hurt you don't keep the space they occupied in you forever. They occupy it intensely for a while, and then the intensity fades, and what's left is something smaller and more manageable. Not forgiveness exactly, which was a word she'd always found too precise for the messiness of the actual feeling, but a kind of release, a setting down. The understanding that carrying something doesn't make it part of you, and that letting it go doesn't mean it didn't happen. She thought about her mother sometimes, in the kitchen in the mornings when the light came through the east window. Her mother had put a cast-iron skillet in her hands at 8 years old, and told her she'd be grateful later, and her mother had been right in ways that extended beyond the cooking. The skillet had been about learning to make something out of what was in front of you, learning to provide. Learning that capability was not a burden. That being able to do things, real things, hard things, was the most reliable form of freedom there was. Matthew was outside when she thought these things, already at the fence or the barn or the pasture, already into the work of the day with the same unhurried focus he'd always had. She'd watch his shape moving in the morning light sometimes and think about Promise Creek, about the specific quality of that October morning when he'd crossed the street toward her, about the moment she'd understood that he was going to step in when stepping in had no practical benefit to him. She'd asked him once, much later, what had made him cross the street. He'd been quiet for a long time before he answered, which she'd long since learned to read as him taking the question seriously rather than him not having an answer. "My father walked past something once," he said. "I was 12. I've thought about it most of my life since." She hadn't asked what the something was. She understood that there are things people carry that they've already done the necessary accounting on, and the accounting is private, and what matters is that they've done it. This is the truth she arrived at, through all of it. Through the street in Promise Creek, and the root cellar, and the night ride to Laramie, and the raid, and the hospital days, and the trial, and the spring, and the years after. That the most important choices are the ones made in the moment when no one is watching and nothing is promised and the cost is real. Thomas had made his choices in those moments. Matthew had made his. She had made hers. The woman who had stood in a public street in 1876 with someone else's price on her had made so many choices since that she couldn't number them all. And each one had built something, the way stones build a wall, individually unremarkable, collectively something that holds. She was not the woman who had been treated like property. She was not the woman who had needed to be saved. She was not the woman that any single moment of her life, good or bad, could wholly define. She was Elizabeth Morgan of the Rocking J Ranch, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. And she had built this life with her own hands, and she knew exactly what it was worth.